You know how they say time heals all wounds? I think that's something people say when the wound is in a gaping chasm where your life used to be. My name is Clara, and for a long time, my world was defined by an absence, a void carved out not just by a departure, but by a deliberate, cold-blooded erasure. It's been over a decade, but some days, the phantom limb of that old life still aches with a throb so profound it steals my breath. And it all started with the scent of lilies, overpowering, sickly sweet, the kind that clings to the back of your throat and reminds you that something beautiful has ended. The day of my father's funeral was a blur of black fabric, hushed condolences, and a persistent drizzle that seemed to weep in solidarity with me. Dad. He'd been my anchor, my quiet strength, the one person who saw me, truly saw me. His study, usually smelling of old books and pipe tobacco, now just felt empty. The silence in the house was a living thing, pressing in on me. I was 20, just finding my footing in the world, and suddenly, the ground beneath me had vanished. But even through the haze of grief, something else pricked at the edges of my awareness. A discomfort, a wrongness I couldn't quite name. It was in the way my mother, Elena, her face a mask of sorrow that didn't quite reach her eyes, leaned into Mark. Mark, my best friend since we were kids who scraped our knees on the same pavements and swore allegiance over shared comic books. He was there, a comforting presence for her, his hand on her arm, then her shoulder, then lingering a little too long at the small of her back. I remember thinking, in a distant, detached way, that he was being a good friend, supporting her. How naive I was. The lilies were everywhere in the church, their white trumpets like silent accusers. I stared at them, trying to focus on their waxy perfection instead of the subtle choreography playing out near the front pew. Elena's grief felt performative. Mark's supportive glances felt possessive. Or maybe I was just drowning in my own sorrow, projecting my disorientation onto them. But a tiny, cold seed of doubt had been planted. I remember a specific moment, during the eulogy given by one of Dad's old colleagues. My gaze drifted. Elena dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, then her head tilted, just so, towards Mark. He met her gaze, a quick, almost imperceptible nod passing between them. It wasn't a look of shared grief. It was something else. Something conspiratorial. My stomach churned. This was my father's farewell, the man who had loved her, provided for her, and here she was, already weaving a new narrative. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing unraveling. The house, once filled with my father's booming laugh and the smell of his woodworking projects, became a stage for Elena and Mark. They were always together, discussing arrangements, the estate, their voices low and urgent whenever I entered a room. I felt like an intruder in my own home, a ghost haunting the periphery of their burgeoning new reality. Then came the day of the reading of the will. We sat in Mr. Henderson's stuffy law office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and unspoken tensions. I expected my father's wishes to be honored. He'd always told me he'd ensure I was taken care of, that the business he'd built, the home he cherished, would provide a foundation for my future. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. His gaze flickered towards me with something akin to pity, and then he began to read. The legal jargon washed over me until a few key phrases sliced through the fog. My beloved wife, Elena, I bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all properties, assets, and holdings. He continued, but I couldn't hear anything beyond the roaring in my ears. My entirety? There was a small, almost insulting provision for me, a token sum, enough to cover a few months' rent in a cheap apartment, to assist her in her transition to independence. I looked at Elena. Her expression was one of carefully crafted solemnity. Mark sat beside her, his hand now openly covering hers on the mahogany table. He didn't meet my eyes. "Mom?" My voice was a hoarse whisper. What is this?" She finally looked at me, a flicker of something cold in her eyes before the mask of sorrow slipped back into place. "Clara, darling, your father and I discussed this. He wanted to ensure I was secure. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you to make your own way." "May make my own way? With what?" The foundation he'd promised had just been dynamited. "But everything?" I pressed, disbelief warring with a rising tide of betrayal. "The house? The business he built for us?" Mark chose that moment to speak, his voice smooth, unctuous. "Clara, your father trusted Elena implicitly. This is what he wanted. We have to respect his final wishes. We? Since when was he part of this we that dictated my father's legacy and my future? The seed of doubt from the funeral blossomed into a sickening certainty. This wasn't just grief making me paranoid. This was a coup, executed with chilling precision. Later that evening, back in the house that was no longer mine, I tried to talk to Elena again. She was distant, almost irritated by my distress. "Clara, you're being dramatic," she said, turning away to adjust a photo of her and my father, a photo where they looked happy, a relic from a time that now felt like a lie. "Mark has been a tremendous support. He's helping me through this." "Mark?" I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. "He was my best friend, Mom. And Dad just passed. Life goes on, Clara," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "And Mark understands what I need right now." Within 3 months, they were married. A small, quiet ceremony, they called it. Respectful. I wasn't invited. I heard about it from a former neighbor who'd seen them leaving the courthouse. Elena radiant in a cream-colored suit, Mark beaming by her side. The final blow came a week after that. A polite, sterile letter from Mark's lawyer, for he was now handling all of Elena's affairs, informing me that they would be selling the family home, and I would need to vacate the premises within 30 days. 30 days to erase 20 years of my life. I packed a single suitcase, mostly with my father's old books and a few clothes. The rest, the memories, the childhood dreams, the sense of belonging, I couldn't take with me. They didn't fit. As I stood on the porch for the last time, I looked back at the house. Mark was watching from the window, his expression unreadable. Elena was nowhere to be seen. The door clicked shut behind me, a sound of absolute finality. The lilies from the funeral might have wilted, but their cloying scent of betrayal, of being utterly and completely discarded, would linger with me for a very, very long time. I was out, with nothing but a pittance and a heart full of ashes. The 10 years that followed were a masterclass in assembling a life from fragments. The initial shock gave way to a gnawing hollowness, then to a cold, hard resolve. If they thought I would simply crumble, they underestimated the one thing my father had truly bequeathed me, his resilience. But resilience is often built on a bedrock of pain, and mine was a fortress. My first apartment was a cramped, damp shoebox above a noisy bakery. The smell of yeast and sugar that wafted up at 4 a.m. was a constant, cloying reminder of a sweetness I couldn't afford, a life I was no longer part of. I found work at a warehouse, long hours of physical labor that exhausted my body, and mercifully, sometimes quieted my mind. Nights were the hardest. The silence of that tiny room was a different beast than the silence of my father's empty study. This was the silence of absolute solitude, of being untethered. Memories of my father became both a comfort and a torment. I'd recall him teaching me to ride my bike, his strong hand steadying me until I wobbled off on my own, his proud laugh echoing down the street, or the time he helped me build a ridiculously ambitious dollhouse, patiently explaining how the tiny joints fit together, his eyes crinkling at my enthusiastic, clumsy efforts. These memories were precious, but now they were overlaid with the bitter knowledge of how easily his legacy, his care for me, had been dismissed by the woman he'd loved, and the young man he'd welcomed into our home like another son, a young man who had been my friend. And Mark. Oh, Mark. Flashbacks of our supposed bond, our shared childhood, would ambush me at the most inconvenient times, building forts in the woods behind my house, sharing secrets whispered in the dark, planning our futures where we'd always be a part of each other's lives. Best friends forever, we'd said. A childish, earnest vow. What a cruel joke that had become. I'd see his face in my mind. Not the smirking, confident man who stood by my mother as my life was dismantled, but the younger Mark, the one with open, honest eyes. The contrast was a fresh stab of pain every time. How could someone change so completely? Or was he always like that? A chameleon, waiting for the opportune moment to show his true colors. The betrayal felt doubled, coming from him, someone I'd trusted with my girlish secrets and dreams. News of Elena and Mark trickled in occasionally, unwanted but inevitable in a world still loosely connected by old acquaintances. They'd sold the house quickly, for a handsome sum. They'd taken lavish holidays, photos appearing on the social media feeds of distant family friends I hadn't bothered to block. Elena, rejuvenated, always smiling, always clutching Mark's arm. They looked like the perfect, happy couple, thriving. Their prosperity felt like it was built directly upon my desolation. Each cheerful update was like a tiny grain of salt rubbed into my still open wounds. I poured myself into rebuilding. I worked during the day, studied at night, slowly, painstakingly earning a degree in architecture. It felt symbolic, learning to design and build structures when my own foundations had been so thoroughly demolished. There was a grim satisfaction in creating something solid, something real, from blueprints and hard work. My designs were often elegant but stark, minimalist, perhaps a reflection of the austerity of my emotional landscape. There were no grand gestures of reconciliation from their end, no olive branches, just a chilling silence. Once, about 3 years in, I received a Christmas card, a generic store-bought card with a printed family photo of Elena and Mark, beaming in front of a Christmas tree in what I assumed was their new, opulent home. It was signed, "Warm wishes, Elena and Mark." No personal note, no acknowledgement of the chasm between us. I remember staring at it, the festive cheer a grotesque mockery. I tore it into tiny pieces and let them fall into the wastebasket like confetti at a funeral. It was their way of saying, "We're fine, we've moved on, and you're a forgotten footnote." The emotional toll was immense. Trust became a foreign concept. Friendships were kept at arm's length. How could I let anyone in when my own mother and best friend had been capable of such profound betrayal? Anger was a constant simmering companion, a low fire in my belly. But I learned to channel it, to use it as fuel for my ambition, for my determination to not just survive, but to build a life they couldn't touch, couldn't taint. I found small solaces: the quiet hum of the library where I studied, the tactile pleasure of sketching designs, the unexpected kindness of a professor who saw potential in my raw talent. I started running, long, punishing runs that cleared my head and exhausted the restless energy that grief and anger produced. These were the small bricks I used to rebuild my world, one painstaking effort at a time. There was a moment, about 5 years after I'd left, when my father's old workshop tools were being auctioned off as part of the final estate clearance. I found out by accident. A part of me, a foolish, sentimental part, wanted to go, to try and buy back a piece of him, a tangible connection. I even drove to the auction house, sat in my car across the street, watching people mill about. Then I saw them, Elena and Mark, emerging from a sleek, expensive car. They looked untroubled, prosperous. Mark had his arm around her, laughing at something she said. The sight of them, so casually disposing of the remnants of my father's life, of my past, solidified something within me. I started the car and drove away. Reaching out, trying to reclaim any part of that past, would be an exercise in futility, an invitation for more pain. They had made their choices. Now, I had to fully commit to mine. My father had once told me, while we were working on a particularly tricky detail for a birdhouse I was obsessed with as a child, "Clara, sometimes you have to sand away a lot of rough wood to find the true grain, the strength within." Those 10 years were my sanding process. They were brutal. They stripped away every illusion, every youthful expectation of fairness or familial loyalty. But beneath it all, I was slowly, painfully, finding my own grain, my own unshakable strength. The scars were there, deep and intricate, an architecture of my survival, and I was learning to live with them, not as marks of shame, but as testaments to the fact that I was still standing. A decade. 10 years is a long time. Long enough for wounds to scar over, even if they never fully disappear. Long enough to build a new life, brick by painstaking brick on the ruins of the old. I was an architect now, with a small but growing reputation. My life was quiet, orderly, and mine. I'd cultivated a detachment, a necessary emotional armor. Elena and Mark were ghosts, relegated to a locked room in the back of my mind, their memory a dull ache rather than a sharp, incapacitating pain. Or so I thought. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, an ordinary, unassuming day. It wasn't a dramatic, hand-delivered subpoena, but a crisp, formal letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. My first thought was that it was a mistake, some professional correspondence misdirected. Then I saw the names mentioned in the body of the letter: Elena Morrison, she'd kept my father's name, a final, bitter irony, and Mark Coleman. My blood ran cold. The letter was cautiously worded, but the implication was clear. Elena and Mark were embroiled in significant legal difficulties. Financial irregularities, it seemed. concerning the very assets my father had built, the assets they had so seamlessly appropriated. There were hints of mismanagement, of deals gone sour, of potential fraud. And then, the crux of it, they were requesting my cooperation, suggesting that my testimony as a character witness, or perhaps providing some historical context about my father's original business dealings, could be beneficial to their current situation. Beneficial to them. My first reaction was a hollow laugh that echoed in my small, neat apartment. The sheer audacity of it. After 10 years of absolute silence, of being treated as less than nothing, they needed me. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. A storm of old emotions surged. The familiar sting of betrayal, the cold fury I thought I'd buried, but also, unexpectedly, a strange, glacial calm. This wasn't just a request. It was an opening, a chink in their carefully constructed world. Their lawyer, a Mr. Davies, requested a meeting. Against my better judgment, or perhaps guided by a nascent, unacknowledged desire for some form of closure, I agreed. We met in his polished, impersonal office, the kind of place designed to project power and success, though it felt more like a sterile interrogation room to me. Elena and Mark were already there when I was shown in. 10 years had changed them, but not in the ways I might have expected. Elena looked frayed. The expensive clothes hung a little loosely. The confident sparkle in her eyes was dimmed by a visible anxiety. Mark, too, had lost some of his swagger. His smile was too quick, his handshake too firm, betraying an underlying nervousness. They were older, yes, but more than that, they looked burdened. The weight of their choices, perhaps, finally catching up. "Clara," Elena began, her voice softer, more tentative than I remembered. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot." Mark chimed in, attempting his old affable charm, but it fell flat. "Clara, good to see you. It's been too long." Too long? Was he serious? I merely nodded, my expression unreadable. I wasn't there for pleasantries. They launched into their carefully rehearsed narrative. They were victims, they claimed, of unscrupulous business partners, of unfortunate market downturns, of misunderstandings. Their words were a tapestry of half-truths and deflections, designed to elicit sympathy. I listened, impassively, letting them spin their tale. As they spoke, I didn't feel the rage I anticipated. Instead, a cold clarity settled over me. They weren't just asking for my help. They were desperate. Their carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and they were grasping at straws. And I, the daughter and friend they'd discarded, was apparently one of those straws. "What exactly do you need from me?" I asked, my voice even, devoid of the turmoil I felt simmering beneath the surface. Mr. Davies, their lawyer, took over. "Ms. Anderson, your mother and Mr. Coleman believe that your testimony regarding your father's business ethics, his intentions for the company, and perhaps even your perspective on their character, could be very persuasive. To demonstrate a long-standing history of integrity associated with the family name and its enterprises. My perspective on their character." The irony was almost suffocating. As I listened, a plan began to form. Not a plan for overt, destructive vengeance. That wasn't my way, and it wouldn't bring me peace. But a plan for truth. The most powerful weapon I possessed was my experience, the unvarnished reality of what they had done. For 10 years, my story had been silenced, my pain ignored. Now, they were unwittingly offering me a stage. I began to gather my thoughts, not evidence to incriminate them further in their current legal woes. That was for the courts to unravel, but the evidence of my own experience. I mentally replayed conversations, their exact words, the dates, the sequence of events that led to my disinheritance and expulsion. The way Elena had said, "Life goes on, Clara." Mark's hollow assurance that this is what he wanted. The Christmas card. The silence. Each memory was a shard of glass, and I was now, very carefully, preparing to lay them bare. There was a flicker of something, pity perhaps, when I looked at Elena's strained face, a ghost of the mother I once loved, but it was extinguished by the memory of her choices, her deliberate severance of our bond. She had sown the wind. Now, the whirlwind was approaching. "I will need some time to consider this," I told them, my voice neutral, "and I'll need to understand more about the specifics of the case to see if my testimony would indeed be relevant." This was partly true, but mostly, I needed time to prepare myself, to ensure that when I spoke, my words would be measured, precise, and irrefutable. They looked relieved, mistaking my calm for acquiescence, perhaps even forgiveness. Mark even attempted a reassuring smile. Knew we could count on you, Clara. Family sticks together, right? The casual hypocrisy of his words almost made me laugh. Family. He had helped destroy mine. I left their lawyer's office with a sense of grim purpose. They saw me as a potential savior, a means to their end. They had no idea that they were handing me the key to my own quiet, long-overdue reckoning. The courtroom wouldn't just be their trial. It would be the stage for my truth. And I would deliver it not with fire and fury, but with the cold, hard weight of a decade of lived experience. The burn would be slow, but it would be deep. They were about to learn that some ghosts don't stay buried. The air in courtroom C was stale, heavy with the scent of old wood polish, anxiety, and the faint metallic tang of justice, or perhaps just its bureaucratic process. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glow on everything. Elena and Mark sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller, more diminished than they had in their lawyer's office. Elena's gaze darted nervously around the room, landing on me for a fleeting second with a desperate, pleading look. Mark attempted a confident posture, but the tightness around his jaw betrayed him. They were hoping I was their lifeline. They had no idea I was the undertow. My name was called, Clara Anderson, to the stand. Walking towards the witness box felt like moving through water. Each step was deliberate. I was aware of every eye on me, but my focus was singular. This wasn't about them anymore. Not really. This was about me, about the young woman they'd cast aside, and the person she'd been forced to become. I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and the words felt less like an oath and more like a personal vow I was finally ready to fulfill. Their lawyer, Mr. Davies, began his questioning with a gentle, almost paternal tone, clearly aiming to paint me as a sympathetic figure who would, in turn, cast a favorable light on his clients. "Ms. Anderson," he started, "thank you for being here. We appreciate this must be difficult for you, given your family history." I simply nodded. "Could you tell the court a little about your father, the late Mr. Thomas Anderson? His character, his business acumen?" This was the opening they'd hoped for. I spoke about my father with genuine respect, highlighting his integrity, his hard work, the way he'd built his company from the ground up. I saw Elena nod subtly, a flicker of relief on her face. Mark leaned forward slightly, encouraged. Then Davies moved to the heart of their strategy. "And Ms. Anderson, after your father's unfortunate and sudden departure, your mother, Elena, and Mr. Coleman, who was a close family friend, stepped in to manage his affairs, is that correct?" "My mother inherited my father's entire estate," I clarified, my voice calm, even. "Mr. Coleman became her husband shortly thereafter and assisted her. The subtle distinction was important. And in your observation, did they strive to uphold the values your father instilled in his business?" Davies pressed, looking for the affirmation. I paused. This was the pivot. The courtroom was silent, expectant. I looked directly at the judge, then let my gaze briefly pass over Elena and Mark. "Mr. Davies," I began, my tone measured. "I can only speak to my direct experiences with my mother and Mr. Coleman following my father's passing. My observation was that their primary focus was on consolidating those assets for their own benefit, with little regard for any prior understanding or my own well-being." A ripple of surprise went through their legal team. Davies frowned slightly. "Could you elaborate, Ms. Anderson?" "Certainly," I said. "Within weeks of my father's funeral, I was informed that his will left me with a token sum. The entirety of his life's work, our family home, everything he had built, was transferred to my mother. Shortly after, she married Mr. Coleman, who had been my closest friend. I let that hang in the air. My mother and Mr. Coleman then made the decision to sell the family home. I was given 30 days to vacate the premises. I was 20 years old and left with virtually nothing, while they began their new life together, funded by my father's legacy." Davies tried to interject. "Ms. Anderson, we are here to discuss their character in relation to these current charges. And I believe this is relevant to their character, sir," I stated firmly but respectfully. "How one treats family, especially in times of vulnerability, speaks volumes. For 10 years, from that point until I received your letter requesting my assistance, I had no contact from my mother or Mr. Coleman, save for a single impersonal Christmas card. I rebuilt my life from scratch, alone. I could see Elena flinch, her face paling. Mark stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle throbbed in his temple. The prosecuting attorney, sensing an unexpected opportunity, was granted permission to cross-examine. Her questions were sharp, direct. Ms. Anderson, you said you were left with virtually nothing. Can you describe what that meant for you? It meant starting over with no safety net, no support system that had just been obliterated. It meant working manual labor jobs to fund my education. It meant years of significant hardship and emotional distress, grappling with the profound sense of betrayal by the two people I should have been able to trust most in the world after my father's loss. My voice remained steady, but the weight of those years was in every word. And in those 10 years, Ms. Anderson, did your mother or Mr. Coleman ever offer any form of support, any apology, any acknowledgement of the position they had put you in? No, I replied. There was only silence, until they found themselves in this current predicament and required my assistance. The words landed with quiet force. There were no theatrics, no raised voice, just the stark, unembellished truth. It was more devastating than any accusation I could have leveled. I wasn't accusing them of the financial crimes they were on trial for. I was simply painting a clear picture of their character, using the canvas they themselves had provided. When asked directly by the prosecutor if I believed them to be individuals of integrity who had simply fallen on hard times, I paused again, a long, deliberate silence. Your Honor, members of the jury, I said, my gaze sweeping across them. My father was a man of integrity. He valued loyalty and fairness. The actions taken by my mother and Mr. Coleman immediately following his passing, actions that directly and negatively reshaped my entire young adult life, were, in my experience, neither loyal nor fair. For 10 years, I was an inconvenience they chose to forget. Their current need for me does not erase that decade. Whether their actions in this particular financial matter were driven by naivety or deliberate intent, I cannot say. But their past conduct towards me demonstrates a capacity for profound self-interest and a disregard for the emotional and material well-being of others when it suited their purposes. You must weigh that as you consider the evidence before you regarding these charges. I saw Elena cover her face with her hands. Mark looked ashen, defeated. Their lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, his earlier confidence completely gone. As I stepped down from the witness stand, a profound sense of lightness washed over me. It wasn't triumph, not the fist-pumping victory of a battle won. It was the quiet, immense relief of an unburdening. The weight I had carried for a decade, the unspoken pain, the invalidated grief, the suffocating sense of injustice, had finally been aired, acknowledged, not in a plea for pity, but as a statement of fact. My answer they would never forget wasn't a shout, but a quiet, clear recitation of the truth they had tried to bury. The outcome of their trial was almost secondary to me at that point. They were found liable on several counts, facing significant financial restitution and a tarnished reputation that would indeed follow them. My victory was internal. Walking out of that courthouse, I didn't look back. The sun felt warmer on my skin. The city sounds seemed sharper, more vibrant. In the weeks that followed, I realized that the poetic justice of their situation, while grimly satisfying on some level, wasn't the source of my newfound peace. The real liberation came from speaking my truth, reclaiming my narrative, and in doing so, severing the last emotional tether that bound me to their toxicity. They needed me, and in that need, they gave me the platform to finally, definitively, set myself free. My inheritance from my father wasn't in assets or property. It was the strength to endure, to rebuild, and ultimately, to define my own worth, independent of anyone else's validation or dismissal. The peace I found wasn't in their downfall, but in my own quiet, resilient ascent. I was no longer the young woman left with nothing. I was a woman who had built everything that mattered, on her own terms, and that was an inheritance no one could ever take away.